failure isn't in the fact that renewables are being used to create power where it's needed. The failure was in the grid to be able to remain balanced and have the right systems in place to ensure that it could be flexible enough.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Confident podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Rob. Rob, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks very much for having me. Yeah, my name is Rob Stait. I'm the Managing Director for Alight BTM, which is the part of Alight Energy Group, the half which provides on-site solar, or behind the meter as it's called, which is solar that's dedicated directly to a customer as opposed to being connected to the grid. Alight itself has been going for around 10 years now, so we've been in the industry for some time, but we're actually quite unusual in the commercial direct solar sector in that we also operate as an independent power producer, so effectively as a grid utility supplier, and we have almost 0.5 gigawatt of solar parks, and mainly across the Nordics, which is also fairly unusual. But the direct solar business that I run is also growing at pace, and we've established a substantial presence now and a good position in the UK, having already grown in Spain, in France, and in Poland. And just briefly, what we do is we deliver substantial bill savings for our customers and provide resilience to power supplies through direct dedicated solar assets. And that's primarily for large energy intensive corporates and through power purchase agreements. So what we're doing is putting cost effective power generation directly where the demand is.
Okay. And explain to me just briefly, quickly, the independent power producer means you are essentially a utility. The PPA means you are putting power behind the meter for companies. So if I am a Widget Inc. company, I can talk to Alight and say, I've got a big field at the back, or I've got a lot of roof space. Can you help me out with my power? Talk to me about that conversation, how it goes.
Yeah, exactly right. So what we're able to do is bypass many of the challenges that we faced with getting grid connected assets live, particularly in the UK, which can be hugely problematic, and put the generation either on site, on land that the client may have, or on their rooftop, even on carports is becoming increasingly common. Or another growth area for us that we're specialist in is something called private wire, where we lease land that is nearby to the site and then feed it directly into the consumer. What that means is that we're able to take more of their load and supply more of the power that they need, a greater proportion of it through solar, which maximizes their savings, and a power purchase agreement will lock those savings in for a long time. You know, solar assets endure for decades, as you know, so these power purchase agreements can be equally decades long, and it's locked in savings and gives them that resilience and that predictability of cost.
Okay, so the power purchase agreement itself is a contract to supply energy for X number of years at guaranteed Y price per kilowatt hour.
Exactly that. Yes, in a nutshell.
Okay, perfect. And obviously, we're all familiar with solar. The sun rises, generates power, sun sets, stops generating power. Do you have a storage option that goes along with the solar panels as well?
Yeah, increasingly energy storage and BESS is part of every conversation that we have now. The stage is set really for BESS. Energy prices through solar have fallen dramatically and continue to fall, but batteries themselves, the price of storage has dropped about 50% in the past 2 years and is forecast to do the same over the next 2 years as well. So it's a fantastic time to actually maximize all those savings that you can get from solar by adding BESS to it. The IEA has recently predicted that there will be a six-fold increase in global storage capacity in the next 5 years by 2030. And what BESS also offers is an abundance of other revenue streams where you actually have a relationship with the grid and can do things like offering flexibility in trading. So this is of huge interest to us, and it's a big focus of ours as a company, and is part of every conversation that we're having with our customers.
There's got to be a bit of a tension there, though. I mean, if, for example, I'm thinking of buying a new laptop and I see that there's going to be a newer version come out in 6 or 8 months' time with faster processor, cheaper, whatever, do I jump in now or do I wait? And what you're saying, this is kind of an analogy we can all come on board with. What you're saying is that battery prices have dropped 50% and they're going to drop another 50% in the next 2 years. And solar panels similarly have come down enormously and are forecast to keep going down. So do I jump in today and get the solar panels and battery storage, or do I wait 2 years when it's going to be 50% cheaper? Or is it more an idea that if I jump in today, I can get solar plus, let's say, 2 hours of storage? I jump in next year, I can get solar plus 3 hours of storage for the same price. And, where does that all work out, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good challenge, and there are other aspects in that mix as well, which I mentioned, the other revenue streams that are available, and how that's actually making the contracts and the supply agreements increasingly complex. And as we know, the energy sector is fraught with volatility and has been forever, and that shows no sign of abating. When is the right time to adopt? When is the right time to make a significant change and commit for the long term? I would actually pare it back to the basics and look at the business case on a base case of savings on your bills today
Mm.
and lock that in for the duration. We're doing PPAs and talking about PPAs that include BESS that are 15, 20 years long and beyond. So whether it becomes cheaper or not, you can lock in those savings today and take more of your load from solar and BESS and less from the grid. To lock in a huge price advantage for decades is really compelling. There's never a right or wrong time, but as soon as you're able to make that business case, then you should adopt. The great thing about BESS is that it's modular. So you can lock in those savings and get the benefits of increased solar provision around the clock through BESS and tariff optimization. But then you can add more BESS capacity in time so that you can actually take more advantage of cheaper prices and of revenue streams through trading. And that's the beauty of BESS. And then looking even further ahead, the argument to building greater resilience as well becomes important as we look at the fragility of grids across Europe, and having solar and BESS, having that hybrid agreement lays the foundation actually then to start looking at decoupling completely from the grid if and when you need to. So having that islandable capability, you've got the foundation there, and it's only a small step away to actually progress into that sort of future as well. So begin with the base case, begin with today's savings, lock that in, and then build from there would be my advice.
Okay. And just, I've never negotiated a power purchase agreement, but, I have done similar things like car leases, for example. And with a car lease, you can pay a certain amount up front and then pay more every month thereafter. Is that similar with a power purchase agreement, that you have an outlay at the start and then you pay monthly, or is it free at the start, no capex, and it's all opex, or is it an it depends conversation?
It depends in terms of what our client's preference is, but by and large, the typical PPA will be zero capex and zero capex over the lifetime. So that's the whole point of it, is that we fund the scheme and fund the scheme for its duration, and we own and operate as well. So it's not our policy to then look to sell it once it's built. We'll stay with it. We will retain ownership of that scheme, and that's important too. But we do have clients as well that will want to use this year's budget and will want to put some money down towards development costs or OPEX costs, things like that. So it can be flexed to a degree, but the great attraction of a PPA is that there is no CapEx outlay.
And of course, then you're doing all the maintenance as well if you maintain ownership.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's a really important factor, is to find a supplier that will work with you from the beginning to design and develop a project, and will work through the construction period and right through the ownership as well. So maintaining the integrity of that supply and giving the client confidence. We work with clients who have had historic deployments that have been sold multiple times and they don't even know now who owns it. And that's that's quite a frightening concept when you think of who could be owning that asset. So it is something to go into the market with eyes wide open, that you want a supplier that is going to remain with that asset.
And of course, obviously, Europe's energy market feels like it's at a bit of an inflection point at the moment. What do you think is the biggest tension you see right now between energy security, affordability, and decarbonisation, for example?
Yeah, there are many inflection points, aren't there? And lots of dynamics are affecting the power markets and the outlook. And actually, demand as well for electricity has plateaued somewhat just recently, but most forecasts align that it's set to dramatically increase over the next decade, driven by things like electrification, energy transition, and of course by the growth in data centers, which itself is driven largely by adoption of AI. So it's fair to say that pretty much any forecast will project dramatic increases in demand. And probably the biggest challenge that we face with all of that is that our grids simply are not set up to cope with that influx of demand. We don't have the infrastructure, but we also don't have the permitting regimes that can bring online new generation fast enough. And I think this is the real challenge facing the energy sector. It's not some fictitious battle between fossil fuel lobbyists and environmentalists. Tapping into more fossil fuels won't solve these fundamental issues that we have. Our grids are based across Europe on centralized infrastructure. So that begins with massive power stations and then distributes out at increasingly smaller scale from there. And that's not fit for purpose in a world where data centers can be pretty much anywhere, and you've got increasingly decentralized demand and new generation capacity like solar being located where that demand is, which is very sensible. And as a result of that, the grid monitoring systems that we have across Europe, I understand, are now regularly showing amber and red in a way that would have been absolutely unheard of perhaps even 5 years ago. These are the things that we're really faced with, that are the massive problems for us to overcome.
Okay, so it's not really technical issues that are at stake here. It is more regulatory that needs to be fixed.
Yes, I think so. If you also look at where the growth is in renewables and in solar in particular, which is forecast to become the dominant power supply across the world over the next 5 or 10 years, it's in small scale. Bloomberg recently reported that small scale is up 30% year on year, where utility scale is actually dropping off a little bit this year. And there are other reasons for that. But there is this boom happening in the market, and it is in those direct dedicated suppliers that generate power where the demand is. So actually embracing that, harnessing it, and making it easier to put that where it's needed can solve many of these issues. And increasingly we're talking to customers that are thinking in much more sophisticated ways about managing their own demand as well, and their exposure to grid fragility, and how they can actually overcome that with intelligent distributed demand management and shifting processing load between locations to cope with fluctuations in power generation. That's part of the solution as well, and increasingly battery storage will be part of every deployment, I expect, in the future. So meeting more of that round the clock demand, but also adding that resilience to customers' power supplies, and as I said, laying the foundation for microgrids and becoming less dependent on grid infrastructure itself.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot of talk here where I'm based in Spain, and we had last April a big blackout on the entire peninsula. There's a lot of speculation about that being caused by too much solar on the grid and the fact that solar doesn't create spinning turbines. And those spinning turbines, it is the gradual slowing of them or the continual spinning of those that keeps grids more stable. If you don't have those because you're not running turbines, you have solar panels, then the grid becomes less stable. What do you say to that argument?
Well, it all points back to the same thing, doesn't it? Which is that we've got distributed demand and an increase in distributed demand. And the real challenge is how we manage that and how we gear up the grid and the flexibility systems so that we can cope with that. And I think that's where the failure was. The failure isn't in the fact that renewables are being used to create power where it's needed. The failure was in the grid to be able to remain balanced and have the right systems in place to ensure that it could be flexible enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what policymakers really need to address, is to make sure that that flexibility is made easier to bring to market. There's a number of factors in that. If you look across Europe and even within a single geography within a country, the quality of data on grid performance and the transparency of that data is hugely variable. So there's massive improvements there, because if investors like ourselves could see where power is most needed and can align that with opportunities that we have, and then if we're confident that we'll get accelerated time to market as a result, then the commercial reality is going to take care of the problem. We'll make sure that that's put in place because it makes economic sense. It's about a shift in thinking away from these centralized grid infrastructure systems and believing that it's that must be preserved. It isn't. It's the complete opposite.
And obviously, as you mentioned, you have different grids throughout Europe in different regions with different levels of digitization. But what about the regulatory landscape throughout Europe? Because you've got to be dealing with different regulators as well in each different country. Is there a patchwork of regulators where some are better than others, or are they all pretty much the same?
Yeah, without a doubt, there is. Some are regulated more thoroughly than others, and even aspects like having statutory timelines for decisions and having transparent criteria for decisions varies dramatically from country to country. And aspects like that are really important to companies like ours. An investor like ourselves, we need that predictability and we need confidence over time to market. So as soon as that becomes unpredictable, then it makes it a less attractive market, which is why we're seeing the growth in the markets where there is better transparency, there is more data available, and there are statutory frameworks that hold the grid operators to account.
Okay. Who's doing well and who's a bit of a laggard?
Yeah, there are the obvious solar adopters that have adopted at scale. Some fantastic renewable stories coming out of Europe just recently, or in autumn of 25, Portugal ran on 6 days, didn't it, entirely on renewables, which was fantastic news. And Germany leads Europe in adoption of solar in particular, but of renewables. And the laggard actually has been the UK, where I'm based. But the UK is catching up fast, and particularly with solar and BESS, this hybrid system that makes a lot more sense. And so we're seeing very rapid growth in the UK as the UK wakes up and sees the business case. And the UK's got some pretty unique aspects, which mean that solar in particular is very attractive. It has the highest industrial electricity charges in the world, and non-commodity elements in there are unlike anywhere else. So the savings can be huge as well, which makes it probably the number one growth market for us at the moment.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you don't think of the UK as being somewhere where solar is going to shine, if you'll pardon the pun. But then again, you mentioned that your company Alight started in the Nordics, which is, you got to think, even less attractive as a solar destination. Although I read recently that Sweden has more hours of daylight annually than Italy. Just not in wintertime, but if you annualize it, Sweden actually has more hours of sunshine than Italy, which is impressive.
Interesting fact. I wasn't aware of that one. I'll be using that in the office for sure. Sweden and the Nordics typically dark for half the year,
Mm.
and yet we've made it work on a unsubsidized basis, and we've made it a commercial success. We're the largest actually solar operator in the Nordics now, and there is a lesson there for other developers and market participants. We were founded in Sweden, and we've made solar work in some of the gloomiest conditions in Europe. So solar really can work anywhere. And then the advancements in panel technology as well just keeps getting better and better every
Mhm.
year. But then with the addition of battery solutions, it really does make it viable anywhere. And that's why it is forecast to become the biggest power source in the world and will be our main route to decarbonising grids around the world.
Yeah. No, because I have a 5 kilowatt solar array on the roof here, which is made up of 18 panels. So you can do the maths there quickly on how many watts I'm getting out of each panel. And that was installed in 2018. But my neighbor across the road, David, installed panels last year, summer 2025. He installed 16 panels and he's getting 8 kilowatts. So, yeah, 500 watts per panel, which is significantly more than mine, over 7 year difference in terms of the technology. So the technology's advanced that much in 7 years that he's getting that much more out of his panels than I am out of mine. So yeah, it's amazing to see in such a short time.
Yeah, exactly. And his panels will be a lot cheaper as well, but it doesn't mean that it was the wrong thing for you to do to adopt. You've already locked in the benefits. That's fundamentally why solar is on this unstoppable boom. It is the cheapest, it is the easiest thing to install. It's the most robust form of power generation that we've ever had. And that's why there's this alignment of forecasts, which expected to become the dominant power supply over the next 5 years or so. And I think we should be celebrating that because every deployment decarbonizes the grid a bit more. It will ultimately have a huge impact in addressing climate change, and that can only be a good thing. It's why we're all in the sector. I think that message is being lost somewhat in the political gloom in the UK with Reform and Farage, and in the US with Trump. So we should be celebrating the success a lot more, I think.
Yeah, and most of your customers are corporates, obviously. Are they rolling out solar for cost reasons, for carbon reasons, for resilience, for something else, for all of the above?
It's definitely all of the above. I think the proportions to which one of the three is a priority will differ from client to client, but the number one is that it has to save money almost always for the first adoption. And that's the interesting
Mm.
thing, that actually the business case will be made on an economic argument but then the other benefits start to be appreciated and gain value, which makes actually savings less important and just a transition to renewables more important generally, because not every site is perfectly suitable, not every site has a substantial load, but just transitioning off the grid and onto a sustainable and more robust power supply is increasingly becoming important, particularly for companies that have already adopted and are already appreciating the benefits.
Can you share a customer success story, an example of how well this has worked for one of your customers?
Sure. Yeah, we tend to work with energy intensive corporates. We're actually fairly picky, fairly selective on the projects that we work with and the companies that we work with, because we do want to stay with the projects and own them for their lifetime. And one of our oldest clients is Lear Corporation, who are a massive player in the aerospace industry. And we've been able to work with them across multiple sites across Europe. And they're a really good example of a company championing that decarbonisation and sustainability agenda, whilst also locking in savings with every site that they do. And they have sites across Europe of varying scale, but we work well together, which means that actually then we can even look at the smaller sites and balance it off as part of a bigger portfolio. And that's how we like to work in partnership with our clients.
And how do you see Europe's clean energy map evolving over the next 5 years with more local generation, more storage, more cross-border trading, a mix of them? How is that going to work out?
Yeah, I mean, there's more investment in grids, there's more interconnectors, some very ambitious interconnections being spoken about
Mm.
across Europe, going a long way under seas and oceans. So those kind of big projects are attractive to governments. Governments like the headline projects, don't they? And so that will be happening. But I would like to see a much more sensible approach to permitting and to fast tracking of new generation that adds value to grids by providing flexibility where the demand is. We're seeing economic benefits from doing that, and the growth of data centers as well. And we're working on some very large projects across Europe at the moment and looking at very large projects. They will drive government to change these regimes because it will be job creation as well. So I think there'll be a gradual shift to decentralizing the management of grid infrastructure by enabling behind the meter supplies and incentivizing customers to do that and to build in and to procure flexibility services so that they can improve the grid, but also by accelerating the projects that are most valuable.
Hmm.
That is a transition that we need to see, but ultimately it's obviously going to be solar and BESS that is at the forefront of what happens over the next 5 years or so. But then the next step will be to make these supplies islandable and to turn them into microgrids. We'll start to see a lot more of that and a lot more of large microgrids as well as the large data center suppliers look to deploy more intelligent demand management across their sites.
Yeah, talk to me a bit about that because that's something that I remember positing as a possibility back between kind of 2006 and 2008 when I was involved in the design and build out of a data center in Ireland. The whole idea that data centers could respond to demand response programs because they've got generation on site, they've got battery backup on site, and they are big consumers. So they could moderate their demand from the grid without changing the amount of energy they're using, just change where they're taking it from in response to demand signals or curtailment signals from the grid operator. Talk to me a little bit about that. Are you seeing that
Yep,
anywhere? Or, I mean,
exactly.
data
Yeah,
data centers are currently being portrayed as the boogeyman, the bad guy who's going to come in and require enormous amounts of electricity. and AI is also being thrown into that picture there. I have my own opinions on that. I don't think the demand from AI is going to be nearly as large as people are forecasting, just because we're seeing massive improvements in AI technologies and their necessity for large amounts of electricity. But that's a whole other conversation. So, no, talk to me a little bit about data centers and your thinking on that, whether they are that boogeyman that everyone fears they are.
Yeah, and on the first point, they're definitely wanting to plan and build their processing sites in a way that they can be linked together and they can distribute their processing load in response to energy prices as well as threats of resilience of the grid or whatever. But in general, we know that data centers are already a significant part of global electricity demand. It's around 2%. The IEA, I think, forecasts that it will more than double over the next 5 years, and that will be driven by AI. And we also know that as they plan for these centres, they are already championing alternative and renewable energy resources. But the problem is that it's taking so long for these things to get built and to come online because of all the planning and permitting and the grid issues that there are. But actually, that increase in demand that AI will generate is, in my view, it needs to be set against the projection of increases in demand in other sectors as well. So we've got electrification happening in sectors like automotive, in transport, across most manufacturing sectors. We've also got this boom in air conditioning, adoption of aircon, and we've got electrified heat as well. So you put those things together, they're actually likely to completely dwarf the needs of AI over the next few years. And what's probably more interesting is how the adoption of AI could deliver some savings to overall electricity use in these sectors. There could actually be a net positive for the energy transition. You look at traditional manufacturing and materials and mineral manufacturing and things like glass and steel and copper, the inefficiency of the energy consumption there is famously huge. I've read that as much as 40% is wasted. So applying AI to those processes could deliver really big savings. And I think it's important to watch the reduction in consumption across traditional sectors adopting AI as it will be to monitor the consumption needs of AI itself, because it could well at least net off, if not be better.
Sure, sure. For anyone who's listening who might be running a large facility or data center, what's the first practical step to start the journey towards something like solar PPAs?
Firstly, understanding your own consumption in detail and being able to map that out and project it. That's how you build the business case. That's pretty much all the data that we need, along with the tariffs, to model it. And from there, you'll be able to know what kind of savings that you can lock in pretty quickly. But I think understanding what your priorities are as a buyer and being really clear on that. What principles are you going to have as a buyer? Are you just going to look for the cheapest? Are you going to look for the biggest name? These kind of aspects become important. What is actually going to be valuable to you as a business? For the larger energy intensive companies that we work with, the durability of that relationship, the longevity of that relationship, the predictability of it over the course of 20 years is really important. We work with water utilities, for example, as well. They're probably not going to disappear anytime soon, and even if they did, it would be into the government. They need to know that they've got a supplier that is going to tick those boxes of reliability, of experience, of getting the project right, of not getting into trouble with things that they've not done before, and being able to stick to timeframes and to solve problems. So I think for anyone considering PPAs, understanding what your priorities are as a consumer and being super clear on that upfront is really important.
And people might not realize, but water utilities are massive users of electricity, right?
It's actually their number one bill. And unusually in the UK, for instance, most of them don't qualify for any energy intensive industry subsidies. So they get hit with the highest charges as well. So you've got this perverse scenario. Obviously, the bills are paid ultimately by consumers, and the water bills are paid by consumers. So actually, the consumers end up paying for these huge non-commodity costs that they have. So yeah, we can provide great savings for them, but most important for a water utility is that reliability of the relationship with their suppliers.
And on a personal note, what keeps you optimistic about Europe's clean energy future?
It's the pace of this adoption is really exciting. It's a fantastic time to be in the sector, despite the political doom and gloom that we have, and despite the influence of Trump and some of his fossil fuel agenda is really biting and is influencing governments. But what we're proof of and what we can see happening in the industry is that commercially it continues to succeed. Even in the US, it
Mhm.
continues to succeed. There was a Yale environment study that showed that more Americans now work in renewables than actually work in the service industry as cashiers or servers, which is a huge shift in the US economy.
Yeah.
So it's part of the fabric of their economic makeup now, and it is an immovable part of that. And it's the same in Europe. And I think that's fantastic. It's the fact that it makes such great economic sense and the fact that it does so much good is really encouraging. I think it's a great time to be in the sector.
Super. So, if on that note, if you could have any person or character, alive or dead, real or fictional, as a champion for clean energy and solar in particular, who would it be and why?
That's a great question, isn't it? And I think to be pragmatic about it, you look at who is having the most influence right now on governments around the world. And the biggest influencer in the world is not Mr. Beast, it's not Cristiano Ronaldo, and unfortunately, it's Donald Trump. Um, Businesses and world leaders are falling over themselves to ingratiate themselves to the leader of the most powerful country on the planet. And he's a climate change denier and he has a fossil fuel agenda.
Mm.
Um, so I think an epiphany of Donald Trump, a rare moment of clear thinking and good sense, whereby he ignores his lobbyists and cronies and instead listens to science and determines that he needs to do something about climate change. That would be the best thing. That would be the thing right now, I think, that could have the biggest impact.
Hoping for miracles.
Yeah, we can but dream.
We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, Rob. Is there any question that I didn't ask that you wish I did, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
Yeah, good question. I think as a champion of solar, perhaps the only other thing that I would highlight is the thing that it often gets criticised for is the impact on local environment and the visual aspect of solar. But in there are many myths, and I think it's really important that people understand that no solar park gets built without bearing in mind the impact on biodiversity and doing something about that. And parks get built now with a minimum biodiversity net gain criteria. So they actually improve the environments that they're in. And we're seeing much more of that, much more agri PV as well, where actually we're able to have a dual purpose land and have cattle and sheep. We've got parks with sheep shading under the solar panels. So I do think that it's something that often gets leveled at the solar industry, but a lot is being done about it. And whilst you can't do a great deal about the visual aspects, it is having a genuinely positive impact on local environments too.
Rob, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed on the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Sure, absolutely. So the website is alight-energy.com. and I myself also on LinkedIn, so do feel free to reach out with me there.
Super, Rob. That's been fantastic. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Tom.